In 1960, two brilliant NSA mathematicians, William Martin and Bernon Mitchell, vanished only to reappear in Moscow. Their defection didn't just expose America's most classified surveillance network. It ignited a ruthless government purge against homosexuals. Why did two privileged insiders betray their country? The summer of 1960 descended upon Washington with a suffocating humidity, matching the intense political paranoia that gripped the capital. The United States was locked in an existential struggle with the Soviet Union, a conflict fought deep within the shadows of espionage, technological superiority, and ideological supremacy. The fear of Soviet infiltration permeated the highest echelons of the American government. Washington was obsessed with identifying anyone who might compromise national security, an obsession that had long surpassed the hunt for actual communist spies and metastasized into a rigid crusade for absolute conformity. It was within this climate that two young men, cleared for the highest levels of classified intelligence, quietly requested their annual leave. They packed their bags, walked out of their heavily fortified offices, and vanished without a trace. Weeks later, the silence was shattered when they reappeared in Moscow, stepping up to a podium to denounce the United States before a global audience. Washington immediately branded them defectors, yet the ensuing investigation quickly mutated, shifting its focus from the secrets they carried in their minds to the secrets they supposedly kept in their bedrooms. The hunt for answers dragged their private lives into the center of one of the most ruthless ideological purges in the history of the American government. Following the Second World War, the United States found itself transitioning from a triumphant military power into an insecure superpower facing a nuclear-armed adversary. The fear of the Red Menace was absolute. The government's primary anxiety was the infiltration of the federal bureaucracy by Soviet agents or sympathizers who could leak state secrets. However, the definition of a security risk rapidly expanded. The prevailing security doctrine dictated that anyone who deviated from the strict social and moral norms of the 1950s was inherently unstable and, therefore, a threat to the state. This logic birthed the phenomenon later known as the Lavender Scare, a systemic, government-sanctioned campaign to identify and expel homosexual employees from federal service. The primary justification for this purge was rooted in the concept of blackmail. Security officials argued that because homosexual men and women were forced by a hostile society to conceal their private lives, they were uniquely vulnerable to extortion by foreign intelligence agencies. The rationale was straightforward and brutally effective. An enemy agent could uncover an employee's hidden sexual orientation and threaten them with public exposure unless they surrendered classified information. This policy constructed a devastating and inescapable paradox for thousands of federal workers. The government demanded absolute candor and unimpeachable character to maintain a security clearance. Yet, if an employee was truthful about being homosexual, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. They would instantly lose their job, their security clearance would be permanently revoked, and they would be subjected to aggressive, humiliating interrogations regarding their personal associations and private behavior. Their careers in public service would be obliterated. Consequently, the very system that demanded total honesty actively forced individuals into deep deception, thereby creating the precise vulnerability the state claimed it was attempting to eradicate. The Lavender Scare did not begin with William Martin and Bernon Mitchell. It had been destroying lives for years prior to their disappearance. Their defection in 1960 merely provided the architects of this purge with the high-profile justification they needed to intensify their relentless scrutiny of federal employees. At the very heart of this crisis was an organization so thoroughly concealed that the vast majority of the American public, and even many within the government, were entirely unaware of its existence. The National Security Agency was established in 1952 through a classified memorandum signed by President Harry S. Truman. While the Central Intelligence Agency operated in the realm of human intelligence, running assets, and orchestrating covert physical operations around the world, the NSA operated in the ethereal and infinite domain of signals intelligence, or SIGINT. Its mandate was staggering in its ambition to intercept, decipher, and analyze the global flow of communications. This included radio transmissions, diplomatic cables, military telemetry, and encrypted exchanges sent across international borders. During the darkest days of the Cold War, the NSA was the primary apparatus for tracking the military capabilities, political intentions, and strategic movements of the Soviet bloc and its allies. Operating this colossal surveillance network did not require men with guns or field operatives trained in the dark arts of physical espionage. The NSA required a completely different breed of personnel. The agency actively recruited the sharpest, most analytical minds the country had to offer. They sought out prodigies in advanced mathematics, abstract logic, complex linguistics, and cutting-edge cryptography. The men and women who walked the sterile, heavily guarded corridors of Fort Meade, Maryland, were tasked with finding patterns in chaos, breaking seemingly unbreakable ciphers, and extracting actionable intelligence from an ocean of electronic noise. William Martin and Bernon Mitchell fit this highly specific profile perfectly. They were brilliant, cerebral, and intensely focused on the complex systems that governed global communications. Their power within the intelligence apparatus did not come from their ability to operate clandestinely in foreign capitals. It stemmed entirely from their extraordinary access. They were granted the privilege of seeing the raw, unfiltered data of international geopolitics, peering into a world of state secrets that the American public was never meant to witness. Martin and Mitchell entered this labyrinth of secrecy in the late 1950s, a time when the NSA was rapidly expanding its capabilities. Both men were assigned to highly sensitive divisions responsible for signals intelligence analysis. Their daily duties immersed them in the absolute most guarded secrets of the American military and intelligence establishment. They knew exactly which geographic regions and nations the NSA was actively targeting. They understood the specific types of international communications that were being intercepted, from mundane diplomatic chatter to the highly classified encrypted messages of foreign militaries. They were acutely aware of the United States' strategic intelligence priorities and were intimately familiar with the advanced technological methods and analytical systems the NSA utilized to shatter foreign codes. Working in such an intense, high-stakes environment, constantly surrounded by the weight of global secrets, naturally forged a powerful bond between the two men. They became close confidants, finding in each other a trusted sounding board for their increasingly critical views. The nature of their work afforded them a panoramic view of American foreign policy in action, and what they saw deeply disturbed them. They began to share a profound and growing disillusionment with the very government they had sworn to serve. They were highly critical of the massive, unregulated scope of the NSA's surveillance operations. Their discussions, held quietly away from the ears of their superiors, revealed a deep discomfort with the gap between the democratic ideals America broadcast to the world and the covert, often aggressive actions it undertook in the shadows. This shared intellectual dissent formed the foundation of their partnership. They possessed an absolute, unshakable trust in one another. It was a trust severe enough and deep enough to allow them to conceptualize and eventually execute a highly treasonous plan to permanently abandon the United States, cross the heavily fortified lines of the Cold War, and surrender themselves to the Soviet Union. The reality of their daily operations at Fort Meade systematically eroded their faith in the American government. The National Security Agency was fundamentally tasked with monitoring the communications of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, a mission justified by the existential threat of nuclear annihilation. However, from their vantage point deep within the signal's intelligence apparatus, Martin and Mitchell observed a surveillance dragnet that extended far beyond the Iron Curtain. They witnessed the routine interception and decryption of private, highly sensitive communications belonging to America's closest allies. French diplomatic cables, British military transmissions, and the encrypted correspondence of neutral nations were all swept up in the NSA's relentless electronic harvest. The agency operated under the assumption that the United States possessed the unilateral right to monitor the globe, a stance executed with absolute secrecy and zero oversight. For the two mathematicians, this aggressive intelligence strategy represented a profound moral failing. They concluded that Washington was actively deceiving the American public and the international community. The United States publicly championed national sovereignty and democratic transparency while covertly violating the borders of its allies through the theft of their most guarded communications. Martin and Mitchell came to believe that this vast, unchecked surveillance apparatus was not preventing a third world war, but actively exacerbating international tensions and driving the globe closer to the brink of nuclear conflict. Their disillusionment did not manifest as loud protests or sudden outbursts. It calcified into a cold, quiet resolve. They determined that submitting a quiet resignation and walking away would achieve nothing. The machine would simply replace them and continue its work in the dark. To stop the machine, or at least severely damage it, they believed it had to be dragged into the light. This ideological rebellion was compounded by the suffocating, paranoid environment of the federal government in the late 1950s. The walls of the NSA were thick with suspicion. The agency employed an aggressive internal security apparatus designed to root out any hint of vulnerability among its staff. Polygraph examinations, unannounced background checks, and intense scrutiny of personal associations were standard procedure. The Lavender Scare was at its peak, and the hunt for homosexual employees was pursued with the same ferocity as the hunt for Soviet spies. In this pressure cooker, any deviation from the rigid social norms of the era was grounds for termination. The historical record indicates that Martin and Mitchell shared a remarkably close bond, an intellectual and personal partnership that set them apart from their colleagues. Whether this relationship crossed into the realm of romance, as the government later heavily implied, is ultimately secondary to the reality of their situation. In the eyes of the 1960s security establishment, they possessed traits and maintained a closeness that flagged them as suspicious. They lived under the constant, exhausting threat of exposure. A single rumor, a misunderstood conversation, or a failed polygraph question could trigger a devastating investigation, resulting in public humiliation and the total destruction of their careers. This relentless psychological pressure, the daily necessity of guarding every word and action, inevitably intertwined with their political grievances. The state they felt compelled to betray on an ideological level was the very same state that threatened to destroy them on a personal level. By the early months of 1960, their theoretical discussions transitioned into concrete planning. Defecting from the United States, particularly from within its most secure intelligence agency, was an operation that required flawless execution. They could not afford a single misstep. They understood that the Central Intelligence Agency maintained a vast network of informants and operatives across Europe and Latin America. Simply arriving at a Soviet embassy in a Western capital would likely result in immediate interception, arrest, and a lengthy term in a federal penitentiary for espionage. Their departure had to be entirely legal, bureaucratic, and utterly mundane. They executed their plan with chilling precision. In June, they submitted standard requests for annual leave. They presented a plausible, unremarkable itinerary to their superiors. framing their absence as a routine holiday to visit family and travel the domestic United States. Their demeanor remained exactly as it always had been, professional, quiet, and deeply focused on their work. They continued to process highly classified intercepts, sit through security briefings, and interact with colleagues without betraying the slightest hint of the monumental treason they were about to commit. They liquidated their assets, gathered their savings, and secured the necessary travel documents. On June 25, 1960, William Martin and Bernon Mitchell walked out of the gates of Fort Meade for the final time. They did not head toward their declared holiday destinations. Instead, they boarded a commercial flight to Mexico City, successfully crossing the first international border. From Mexico, they secured passage on a flight to Havana, Cuba. The island nation, recently taken over by Fidel Castro's revolutionary government, served as a crucial transit point, a safe harbor outside the immediate reach of American law enforcement. In Havana, they finally made direct contact with Soviet intelligence. The KGB, recognizing the immense strategic and propaganda value of two NSA analysts, offering themselves on a silver platter, quickly arranged their covert transport. They boarded a Soviet freighter destined for the Eastern Bloc, slipping entirely out of the Western Hemisphere. Back in Maryland, the bureaucratic machinery of the National Security Agency ground on, entirely unaware that it had been catastrophically breached. When they failed to return to their desks in late June, the first ripples of alarm began to spread. 2 desks remained empty. Initial inquiries were casual, assuming a delayed flight, a minor accident, or a simple miscommunication. But as days passed with no contact, the casual inquiries hardened into frantic investigations. Security officers visited their residences, finding them abandoned. Their families were contacted, revealing they had no idea where the men were. The dawning realization within the upper echelons of the NSA was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. This was not a case of stolen documents or a compromised field agent. 2 brilliant minds, possessing encyclopedic knowledge of the United States' most sensitive intelligence targets, its cryptographic capabilities, and the very architecture of its global surveillance network, had simply vanished. The agency immediately initiated a damage assessment, desperately trying to catalog exactly what information Martin and Mitchell had access to in their final months. The conclusion was devastating. They held the keys to the kingdom. If they had fallen into the hands of the Soviet Union, the damage to American national security would be incalculable. The quiet disappearance of 2 mathematicians was about to ignite a geopolitical firestorm. The silence that followed their disappearance was absolute, and in the halls of the American intelligence apparatus, silence was the most terrifying sound of all. Late June bled into July, and the initial bureaucratic confusion at the National Security Agency rapidly hardened into institutional panic. When the scheduled return date for William Martin and Bernon Mitchell passed without a phone call or a telegram, the internal alarms at Fort Meade were tripped. This was not a sprawling, disorganized government department where an employee might be overlooked for weeks. This was the most tightly controlled, highly compartmentalized security environment in the Western world. Every analyst was a monitored asset. When 2 of those assets vanished simultaneously, the response was immediate and ruthless. The investigation began quietly, restricted to the highest echelons of the NSA and the Department of Defense. It was an exercise in frantic damage control, driven by the desperate hope that the 2 men had simply suffered an accident or decided to extend a domestic holiday without notifying their superiors. Security agents were dispatched to their residences in Laurel, Maryland. The apartments were found locked, undisturbed, and deeply unsettling in their normalcy. There were no signs of a struggle, no ransacked drawers, no hurried packing. Clothes hung in the wardrobes. Perishable food sat rotting in the refrigerators. It was the calculated stillness of men who wanted to leave no immediate trace of their intentions. However, Investigators quickly discovered subtle discrepancies. Bank accounts had been completely drained of funds. Personal vehicles were left behind, keys resting on kitchen counters. A close examination of their final days revealed that they had systematically severed their minor domestic ties, paying off outstanding bills and canceling local deliveries. These were not the actions of men planning to return after a brief summer holiday. They were the meticulously executed final steps of a permanent departure. When this reality set in, the nature of the investigation fundamentally shifted. It ceased to be an internal human resources anomaly and escalated into a catastrophic national security crisis. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the iron grip of J. Edgar Hoover, was brought in to spearhead the manhunt. Hoover's FBI possessed unparalleled resources and operated with a domestic authority that bordered on absolute. Agents swarmed the NSA headquarters, interviewing superiors, colleagues, and anyone who had shared a cup of coffee with the missing analysts. They seized their personnel files, their security clearance evaluations, and every piece of paper they had touched in the preceding months. The timing of this crisis could not have been worse for the United States government. The Eisenhower administration was already reeling from a profound geopolitical humiliation. Just months prior, in May 1960, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers had been shot down deep inside Soviet airspace. The United States had initially lied to the world, claiming it was a weather plane that had strayed off course, only for Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to produce the captured pilot and the wreckage of the advanced espionage aircraft. The U-2 incident had shattered the illusion of American moral superiority, deeply embarrassed President Dwight D. Eisenhower on the global stage, and derailed a crucial summit in Paris. The administration was bleeding credibility and deeply paranoid about further Soviet intelligence victories. Now the Pentagon faced a disaster that threatened to eclipse the U-2 shootdown. A captured pilot could reveal the mechanics of a single aircraft and the flight paths of specific missions. Two defecting NSA analysts could reveal the entire architecture of the United States global eavesdropping network. The damage assessment conducted deep within the Pentagon was a grim accounting of vulnerabilities. Martin and Mitchell had intimate knowledge of the NSA's most critical operations. They knew the locations of highly classified listening posts scattered across allied nations, forming an electronic ring around the Soviet Union. They understood the complex mathematical models used by American cryptologists to attack Soviet ciphers, and, perhaps most devastatingly, they knew exactly which Soviet codes the Americans had successfully broken. If this knowledge was handed to the KGB, Moscow could instantly blind the United States, changing their codes, shutting down compromised communication channels, and plunging American intelligence into the dark. As the FBI dug deeper into the lives of the two men, Hoover's agents applied the rigid, prejudiced security doctrines of the era. Investigators expanded their search beyond political dissent, actively hunting for the personal traits that the Lavender Scare deemed synonymous with treason. Investigators interviewed neighbors, childhood friends, and university professors. They compiled dossiers that meticulously detailed the men's personal habits. The FBI noted that Martin and Mitchell were inseparable, spending their weekends together playing chess, discussing complex mathematics, and avoiding the traditional social expectations of young men in the 1950s. They did not date women, they did not frequent the local bars, and they maintained a fiercely private existence away from the prying eyes of their colleagues. In the fevered atmosphere of the investigation, this intense friendship was immediately weaponized. The FBI's analytical machinery did not seek nuance, it sought categorical vulnerabilities. The investigators concluded that the close nature of their relationship strongly indicated homosexuality. In the context of 1960s security protocols, this was not merely a biographical detail. It was the definitive explanation for their betrayal. The government desperately needed a narrative that absolved the institution. If Martin and Mitchell defected because they held legitimate ideological grievances against the American surveillance state, it would imply a fundamental flaw in the morality of the NSA's mission. However, if they defected because they were sexual deviants, fleeing the moral righteousness of American society, the institution remained pure. The failing belonged entirely to the corrupt nature of the individuals. This conclusion ignited a brutal internal purge at Fort Meade. The disappearance of Martin and Mitchell shattered the illusion of an impenetrable vetting system, and the NSA responded by turning its formidable surveillance apparatus inward. A climate of absolute terror descended upon the agency's workforce. Any analyst who had worked closely with the missing men, who had shared a desk with them, or who had engaged in casual political debates in the cafeteria, was immediately hauled in for aggressive interrogation. Polygraph machines ran continuously. Questions shifted rapidly from professional duties to highly intrusive inquiries about personal lives, sexual preferences, and private associations. Careers built over decades of loyal service were destroyed in a matter of hours based on nothing more than proximity to the defectors or a momentary hesitation on a polygraph test. Security clearances were summarily revoked, and men and women were escorted from the building, their lives ruined by the contagion of suspicion. The Lavender Scare, which had always operated as a low-level hum of anxiety within the federal bureaucracy, was suddenly amplified into a deafening roar. The hunt for communists and the hunt for homosexuals became inextricably linked in the minds of the security establishment. The betrayal of Martin and Mitchell provided the definitive, undeniable proof that the hardliners had been seeking for a decade. The enemy was not just at the gates. The enemy was already inside, hidden behind the mask of moral deviance. For 6 agonizing weeks, the United States government managed to keep the disappearance out of the public eye. The Pentagon hoped against hope that the men had defected to a neutral country, or that Soviet intelligence had not yet realized the immense value of the asset they possessed. But secrets of this magnitude cannot be contained indefinitely within a democratic system. By early August, rumors began leaking to the press. Journalists caught wind of the frantic internal investigations, the sudden dismissal of NSA personnel, and the undeniable absence of 2 highly cleared analysts. On August 5, 1960, forced into a corner by mounting press inquiries, the Department of Defense released a terse, heavily sanitized statement. The Pentagon admitted that 2 junior mathematicians employed by the National Security Agency were entirely unaccounted for. The statement deliberately downplayed their significance, categorizing them as low-level technicians with minimal access to vital secrets. It was a desperate, transparent attempt at damage control, a blatant lie designed to calm a nervous public and mitigate the international fallout. But the press was not easily placated. Journalists quickly uncovered the true nature of their security clearances, revealing that Martin and Mitchell held access to information far beyond the scope of ordinary technicians. The American public, already unnerved by the escalating tensions of the Cold War and the recent U-2 embarrassment, reacted with widespread alarm. How could the most secure agency in the world simply lose 2 of its brightest minds? What secrets were currently walking the streets of a foreign capital? Washington braced for the inevitable blow. The silence from the East was deafening. The Soviet Union had not made a single public statement regarding the missing Americans. This calculated silence was a well-known tactic of the KGB. It meant they were currently debriefing the defectors, draining them of every piece of actionable intelligence, verifying their claims, and carefully scripting the political narrative. The United States government could do nothing but wait. They watched the international wire services, monitored Soviet radio broadcasts, and prepared for the moment when their own secrets would be weaponized against them on the global stage. The crisis had moved beyond the control of the FBI or the Pentagon. The next move belonged entirely to Moscow. The agonizing Zweit broke on the morning of September 6, 1960. The silence from the East was shattered not by a diplomatic cable or a back-channel military whisper, but by the blinding flash of international media cameras. The Soviet government, having carefully drained their new assets of technical intelligence and meticulously scripted the political theater, finally played its hand. The venue was the House of Journalists in Moscow, an imposing building that frequently served as the stage for Soviet state propaganda. The room was packed with hundreds of foreign correspondents, wire service reporters, and Soviet journalists, all summoned for a major, undisclosed announcement. The air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. Then the doors opened, and the greatest security failure in the history of the National Security Agency walked to the podium. William Martin and Bernon Mitchell took their seats beneath the glaring lights. They did not appear coerced, broken, or fearful. They wore sharp suits, their demeanor calm and deliberate. They were two young, highly educated Americans who had freely chosen to cross the ideological divide, and they were about to deliver a devastating blow to the nation that had trained them. The press conference was a masterstroke of Soviet political warfare. The timing was brutally precise. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was preparing to travel to New York to address the United Nations General Assembly. He needed a weapon to deflect criticism over the aggressive posturing of the Soviet bloc, and Washington had inadvertently provided him with the ultimate ammunition. Martin and Mitchell began to read from a prepared statement, their voices echoing through the microphones and instantly transmitting across the globe. Bypassing personal grievances or workplace disputes, they launched a calculated, articulate, and absolute condemnation of American foreign policy and the vast surveillance state that underpinned it. For the first time in history, the deeply guarded existence of the National Security Agency was dragged out of the classified shadows and exposed to the global public. The agency, so secretive that its own government jokingly referred to it as no such agency, was suddenly front-page news from London to Tokyo. Martin and Mitchell meticulously detailed the scope of American signals intelligence. They informed the assembled press that the United States government was actively intercepting, decoding, and reading the private, encrypted communications of nearly every nation on Earth. The most damaging revelation was not that the Americans were spying on the Soviet Union. That was an accepted, unspoken reality of the Cold War. The catastrophic blow came when the defectors explicitly confirmed that the NSA was aggressively monitoring the communications of America's closest allies. They revealed that the United States routinely intercepted the diplomatic cables of France, Italy, Turkey, and various Latin American nations. They exposed a program where Washington demanded absolute loyalty from its allies, while secretly treating them as targets of high-level espionage. The young mathematicians articulated a clear, ideological justification for their treason. They argued that the United States government was operating with profound hypocrisy, publicly condemning the Soviet Union as a totalitarian menace, while covertly executing intelligence operations that blatantly violated the sovereignty of independent nations. They cited the recent U-2 spy plane incident as proof that Washington routinely lied to the international community. They stated unequivocally that they believed American intelligence practices were not defensive, but inherently provocative, risking a global nuclear war to satisfy an insatiable demand for information. They concluded their statement by formally declaring their decision to seek asylum in the Soviet Union, a nation they claimed offered a truer path to global peace. The broadcast of this press conference triggered an immediate seismic shockwave through the corridors of power in Washington. The Eisenhower administration was paralyzed by the sheer audacity and scale of the exposure. The damage was entirely unprecedented. It was a dual-pronged disaster, a public relations catastrophe on the global stage, and a silent, terrifying operational collapse within the military-industrial complex. The diplomatic fallout was instantaneous. Allied governments in Europe and South America, deeply embarrassed by the revelation that their secure communications were being read in Maryland, demanded answers. American ambassadors were summoned in foreign capitals to explain the blatant violation of diplomatic trust. The United States was forced into a humiliating posture of denial and evasion, completely unable to refute the specific, highly technical claims made by two men who had physically operated the machinery of the betrayal. Behind the closed doors of the Pentagon, the public relations disaster was entirely secondary to the catastrophic cryptographic reality. The press conference was merely the visible tip of a massive intelligence iceberg. Military commanders and intelligence directors knew that whatever Martin and Mitchell had stated publicly was only a fraction of what they had already surrendered privately to the KGB. In the weeks between their disappearance in June and their public surfacing in September, they had undoubtedly been subjected to intense, exhaustive debriefing by Soviet intelligence officers. The immediate assumption at the NSA was a total system compromise. The defectors possessed intimate knowledge of the mathematical algorithms the United States used to secure its own top-secret communications. They knew the physical locations of listening posts in the Middle East and Europe. They understood the strategic priorities that dictated which Soviet targets were monitored and which were ignored. Most lethally, they possessed specific knowledge regarding exactly which Soviet and Eastern Bloc codes the NSA had successfully cracked. This technical knowledge handed the Soviet Union a terrifying strategic advantage. Moscow could immediately shut down the compromised communication channels, starving the NSA of actionable intelligence. They could alter their cryptographic protocols, rendering American deciphering equipment useless. Furthermore, they could use their knowledge of American intelligence priorities to feed Washington highly sophisticated disinformation, trapping the United States in a web of its own compromised surveillance network. The NSA was forced to undertake a massive multi-million-dollar overhaul of its entire cryptographic infrastructure. Every code, every procedure, every assumption about the security of American communications had to be scrapped and rebuilt from the ground up. The agency was effectively blinded and forced to fight in the dark. Faced with a disaster they could neither contain nor deny, the United States government pivoted to the only strategy remaining: absolute character assassination. The facts presented by Martin and Mitchell in Moscow were unassailable. They were accurate, deeply informed, and highly damaging. Therefore, the government resolved that the men delivering the facts had to be destroyed. If the administration could shatter their credibility, they could blunt the impact of their revelations. The bureaucratic machinery that had failed to detect their defection was immediately repurposed to construct a narrative of moral deviancy. The initial FBI investigations, which had noted the intense, private nature of their friendship, were suddenly elevated from internal security files to public talking points. The government actively began to leak insinuations to a pliant domestic press. Off-the-record briefings with prominent journalists planted the seed that Martin and Mitchell were driven entirely by severe psychological instability and sexual deviance, rather than any ideological principles. The Lavender Scare, previously a quiet, brutal bureaucratic purge, was dragged into the blinding light of national security policy. The government heavily implied, without offering a shred of concrete evidence, that the two men were part of a homosexual underground. They leaned on the deeply ingrained prejudices of 1960s America, calculating that the public would readily dismiss the political arguments of men branded as sexual perverts. The narrative was forcefully shifted. The story was no longer about an out-of-control intelligence agency violating international law. The story became about two weak, compromised individuals who had betrayed their country, because they lacked the moral fortitude required of true Americans. This aggressive counter-narrative was championed by powerful political figures who saw an opportunity to consolidate their own power. Representative Francis Walter, chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, seized upon the defection with rabid enthusiasm. He immediately announced sweeping congressional investigations into the personnel practices of the Department of Defense and the NSA. Walter, a staunch architect of both anti-communist and anti-homosexual witch hunts, used the Martin and Mitchell case as the ultimate undeniable proof that sexual deviance was inextricably linked to treason. The congressional hearings that followed were not an objective inquiry into a security failure. They were a heavily orchestrated political tribunal. The committees demanded to know exactly how two suspected homosexuals had bypassed the rigorous vetting procedures of the military. They interrogated NSA directors, security officials, and psychologists, demanding absolute assurances that the federal workforce would be purged of anyone displaying traits deemed abnormal. The government effectively weaponized the defection against its own citizens, using the actions of two men in Moscow to justify a reign of terror against thousands of federal employees in Washington. The paradox of this aggressive strategy was stark. By focusing entirely on the alleged moral failings of the defectors, the government successfully distracted the American public from the very real, very frightening capabilities of the National Security Agency. But in doing so, they officially cemented a fatal flaw in their own security doctrine. They solidified the belief that looking for character flaws was an effective way to hunt for spies, entirely missing the reality that the most dangerous ideological betrayals are often committed by those who appear the most ordinary. The witch hunt had begun in earnest, and it required a constant supply of victims to sustain the illusion of security. The machinery of the Lavender Scare, previously an internal and somewhat bureaucratic mechanism of discrimination, was now operating at maximum capacity and with full congressional endorsement. The National Security Agency, an institution that had spent its entire existence shielded from legislative oversight by its highly classified nature, found its doors kicked open by hostile congressional committees. Representative Francis Walter and his allies on the House Un-American Activities Committee demanded absolute compliance from the Department of Defense. They were no longer satisfied with quiet dismissals. They wanted a systematic, highly visible purge. The defection of William Martin and Bernon Mitchell provided them with the ultimate political capital. The logic presented to the American public was brutally simple. If two men who exhibited abnormal personal traits could hand the nation's deepest secrets to the Soviet Union, then every individual with a hidden private life was a dormant weapon waiting to be activated by the KGB. Within the confines of Fort Meade, the result of this congressional pressure was a reign of administrative terror. The NSA implemented security protocols of unprecedented severity. The polygraph, a machine of highly disputed scientific validity even in 1960, became the ultimate arbiter of a person's career and loyalty. Analysts, linguists, and cryptologists who had spent years intercepting Soviet communications were strapped to the machines and subjected to deeply invasive interrogations. The questions deviated entirely from their access to classified material or their political affiliations. Interrogators demanded detailed accounts of their subjects' sexual histories, their private associations, the bars they frequented, and the nature of their friendships. Any hesitation, any spike in heart rate, or any refusal to answer these humiliating inquiries was interpreted as an admission of guilt. The purge was swift and merciless. Hundreds of employees across the intelligence community and the broader federal government were quietly stripped of their clearances and escorted from their buildings. They were given no avenue for appeal and no clear explanation other than a failure to meet the rigid moral standards of national security. The government effectively weaponized the treason of Martin and Mitchell against its own loyal workforce, using a singular, politically motivated defection to justify the destruction of thousands of innocent careers. The Lavender Scare achieved its most devastating apex not because the threat of espionage had increased, but because the government needed a scapegoat to distract from its own catastrophic failure in personnel management. While Washington tore itself apart in a frenzy of suspicion and moral panic, the situation in Moscow was undergoing a quiet, inevitable transformation. The blinding lights of the House of Journalists eventually dimmed. The international reporters filed their copy. The headlines dominated the global news cycle for a few weeks, and then the media attention predictably moved on to the next crisis. For William Martin and Bernon Mitchell, the fading of the flashbulbs marked the end of their utility as active propaganda weapons and the beginning of the grim reality of life as defectors in a totalitarian state. In the immediate aftermath of their press conference, they were treated as elite guests of the Soviet government. They were provided with comfortable apartments, generous stipends, and the privileges afforded to high-value intelligence assets. The KGB paraded them at carefully orchestrated social events, using their presence to reinforce the narrative of American imperialist decay. They were living symbols of Soviet ideological superiority, two brilliant minds who had seen the dark heart of American capitalism and chosen the enlightened path of communism. But the value of a defector is an inherently depreciating asset. Once they had surrendered all their technical knowledge regarding the NSA's cryptographic capabilities, and once their public statements had been thoroughly exploited for propaganda, their status within the Soviet hierarchy plummeted. They quickly discovered that the Soviet Union they had romanticized from the sterile corridors of Fort Meade did not exist. They had fled the United States citing a profound disgust with a government that spied on its citizens, violated international sovereignty, and maintained a massive, unaccountable surveillance apparatus. The staggering paradox of their decision was that they had sought refuge in the absolute epicenter of global state surveillance. The Soviet Union operated a domestic intelligence network that dwarfed the capabilities of the NSA. The KGB monitored every aspect of daily life, controlled the press with absolute authority, ruthlessly suppressed political dissent, and maintained a vast network of internal informants. Martin and Mitchell had traded a flawed, hypocritical democracy for a rigid, brutal authoritarian regime. Furthermore, if the oppressive, homophobic culture of 1950s America had contributed to their desire to defect, their choice of sanctuary was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Soviet Union was not a haven for personal freedom or sexual liberation. In fact, it was significantly more draconian. Under Article 121 of the Soviet Criminal Code, consensual homosexual acts between men were strictly prohibited and punishable by up to 5 years of hard labor in the Gulag system. The state viewed homosexuality not merely as a moral failing, but as a bourgeois, capitalist disease designed to weaken the socialist state. The KGB aggressively monitored suspected homosexuals, using the threat of imprisonment to recruit informants and enforce absolute social conformity. The narrative that Martin and Mitchell fled to Moscow to live freely as a gay couple is thoroughly dismantled by the harsh legal and social realities of the Soviet system. They had willingly walked into a society that would have imprisoned them for the very private lives the American government suspected them of having. As the years progressed, the reality of life behind the Iron Curtain stripped away their ideological illusions, and their paths sharply diverged. William Martin quickly found the Soviet bureaucracy suffocating and the constant KGB surveillance intolerable. Stripped of his elite status after repeatedly demanding exit visas, his life deteriorated. He eventually secured passage to Tijuana, Mexico, where he spent his final decades in absolute obscurity before dying in 1987, a man entirely without a country. Bernon Mitchell, conversely, chose total submission to the Soviet system. He married a Russian woman, accepted a modest academic post, and submerged his identity into the working class. He survived the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, witnessing the total failure of the communist experiment he had supported. Mitchell died in St. Petersburg in 2001. They passed away as relics of a forgotten crisis, forever separated from the lives they had known. The true historical weight of William Martin and Bernon Mitchell, however, does not reside in the grim trajectory of their final years. Their legacy is permanently etched into the bureaucratic scars they left behind in Washington. The immediate cryptographic damage they inflicted upon the National Security Agency was eventually repaired. Codes were rewritten, listening posts were relocated, and the American surveillance apparatus adapted, expanding into the digital age with even greater reach. The lasting devastation of their defection was entirely domestic. By fleeing to Moscow, they handed the architects of the Lavender Scare the ultimate weapon to justify a campaign of systemic cruelty against their own citizens. In the immediate aftermath, the National Security Agency operated under the paranoid assumption that any deviation from strict social norms was a precursor to further treason. The security divisions intensified their internal purges. Dozens of highly skilled, deeply loyal intelligence officers were systematically hunted down, humiliated, and forced out of the agency. Careers built over decades were abruptly destroyed, based entirely on whisper campaigns, anonymous accusations, and the flawed pseudoscience of the polygraph machine. Men and women who had dedicated their lives to public service were marched out of Fort Meade, their security clearances permanently revoked. The defection breathed new life into the dying embers of the Lavender Scare, allowing the security apparatus to ruthlessly target its own workforce. The profound irony of this era was that the security establishment actively weakened the nation it was sworn to protect. By enforcing a rigid, prejudiced moral code, the government deliberately alienated thousands of its brightest minds. Furthermore, the Lavender Scare completely failed its primary objective. There is no historical evidence that purging homosexuals from the federal workforce prevented a single act of Soviet espionage. The most damaging spies of the Cold War, men like Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, were heterosexual, married men who betrayed their country for cold, hard currency, completely bypassing the moral profiling that obsessed the security apparatus. The hunt for sexual deviance did not catch spies. It merely provided the government with a convenient scapegoat for its own administrative and intelligence failures. Yet, dismissing Martin and Mitchell simply as catalysts for a domestic witch hunt ignores the complex ideological questions they forced into the light. The grievances they voiced in Moscow in September 1960 were not fabricated. They correctly identified a massive, unchecked surveillance state that operated completely outside the boundaries of democratic oversight. They accurately exposed the hypocrisy of a government that demanded absolute trust from its allies while secretly harvesting their diplomatic and military communications. In many ways, their critiques foreshadowed the massive intelligence debates of the 21st century, predating the controversy surrounding global mass surveillance by over 50 years. They recognized a fundamental danger in allowing a secretive agency to operate without accountability. But they fundamentally corrupted their own message through the method of their dissent. They did not leak their findings to the American press to spark a domestic debate. They handed the operational blueprints of American intelligence directly to the KGB. They crossed the indelible line separating the dissident from the traitor. By placing highly classified technical knowledge into the hands of a totalitarian adversary, they actively endangered the lives of American military personnel and intelligence operatives across the globe. They demanded transparency from Washington, but they sought it by arming a regime that weaponized secrecy and crushed all forms of truth. They were correct in their diagnosis of the disease, but the cure they selected was fatal. The story of the 1960 NSA defection remains one of the most deeply unsettling chapters of the Cold War, a narrative utterly devoid of heroes. It is a history populated entirely by compromised institutions and flawed men. The National Security Agency failed to recognize the deep ideological fractures within its own highly cleared workforce. The Soviet Union exploited two disillusioned youths, paraded them for political gain, and then discarded them into the machinery of an oppressive state. And the United States government chose to answer a catastrophic security breach not with introspection, but with a blind, prejudiced fury that destroyed the lives of thousands of its most loyal citizens. The tragedy of William Martin and Bernon Mitchell is the tragedy of absolute certainty. They possessed the arrogance to believe that they alone understood the geopolitical truth, and that this understanding justified the ultimate betrayal. They sought a perfect ideological system and found only the crushing weight of totalitarianism. In their wake, they left a fractured intelligence community and a society that had turned its deepest fears against itself. They exposed the darkest secrets of the American surveillance state, but their legacy is entirely defined by the thousands of innocent lives ruined by the panic they left behind. When a nation demands impossible moral perfection from its citizens, and when it enforces loyalty through terror rather than trust, it builds a fortress that is infinitely fragile from within. And if a democracy chooses to secure its future by systematically destroying the lives of its own people, what exactly is left for it to defend?